2 drinks and a sack of wheat, the price paid for the Apache woman the cowboy took home. The sun was just starting to dip behind the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, painting the dusty plains in shades of orange and gold. The wind carried a dry, whispering rustle through the tall grasses, and the lone cowboy adjusted the brim of his hat as he rode along the uneven trail. For years, he had traveled these lands alone, moving from one small settlement to another, never staying long, always chasing work or shelter, yet never finding a place that felt like home. His horse, a sturdy bay mare with a coat like polished mahogany, walked steadily, unbothered by the rough terrain or the emptiness stretching for miles in every direction. The cowboy had grown used to the silence, to the empty horizon, to the lonely nights when only the wind and distant coyote howls kept him company. As he approached a small trading post, a cluster of wooden buildings with peeling paint and sagging roofs, he could see that it was busier than he had expected. Smoke curled lazily from a chimney, carrying the smell of baked bread and roasting meat into the dry air. A few settlers milled around, talking and laughing, and a group of men were unloading crates from a wagon. The cowboy slowed his horse and scanned the area carefully, his sharp eyes noticing the details others might miss. The nervous glance of a boy carrying bundles of firewood, the worn boots of a trader who had been on the road too long, the way the sun reflected off the iron hinges of the post's gates. He tied his horse to a post and stepped down, dust rising in soft clouds around his boots. The wooden boards of the trading post creaked under his weight as he entered, and the smell of dried herbs, leather, and cooking filled his nose. Behind the counter, a man with a thick beard and a sunburned face was arranging small trinkets and jars of spices, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Afternoon," the cowboy said, his voice low but clear. "Afternoon, stranger," the trader replied, giving him a careful look. "You're far from town. What brings you here?" "Just passing through," the cowboy answered, his eyes already scanning the room. He noticed the quiet tension at one corner of the post. A small group of men had gathered around something, or someone. As he moved closer, he saw a young woman sitting on a crate, her hands tied gently in front of her. Her hair, dark and straight, fell over her shoulders, and her eyes, sharp and watchful, darted between the men, never settling as if she were calculating every move. The cowboy felt a pang of curiosity, and something heavier, something like concern. "She's for sale," one of the men said, noticing his gaze. "Young, strong, smart, just needs a good home." The words struck the cowboy in a way he wasn't expecting. "For sale?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," the man replied casually, as though talking about a horse or a cow. "Price is 2 drinks and a sack of wheat. Take it or leave it." The cowboy blinked. He had heard of bartering, of trading goods for labor or help, but the ease with which they spoke about the young woman made his stomach tighten. He stepped closer, studying her face. There was defiance in her eyes, yes, but also exhaustion, as though life had taught her to stay alert at all times. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands flexed against the ropes, small but deliberate movements that hinted at strength. 2 drinks and a sack of wheat," he repeated slowly, more to himself than to anyone else. The men laughed as if it were a joke, but the cowboy didn't. He understood the reality. She wasn't a joke, and this was not a simple transaction. But something in him stirred, something protective, something that told him this was not right. "I'll take her," he said finally, surprising even himself. The trader's eyes widened. "You serious? That's all it takes. 2 drinks and a sack of wheat, and she's yours." The cowboy nodded, handing over the agreed items. He felt the weight of what he had done immediately. It wasn't just 2 drinks and a sack of wheat. It was a decision that would change lives, including his own. He knelt slightly and untied her hands, and she eyed him carefully, suspicion clear in her sharp gaze. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to," he said gently, standing and brushing the dust off his coat. "We'll just get you somewhere safe." She didn't speak at first. Instead, she got to her feet and moved cautiously, keeping her distance but following him as he led his horse around. The cowboy watched her carefully, noting the careful way she placed her feet, the way she observed every detail of the environment. This was no ordinary woman, he realized. She had survived far more than he could imagine. And yet there was something fragile about her too, a vulnerability that made him uneasy. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the plain. The journey ahead would not be easy. There were miles of rough trails, treacherous river crossings, and the constant threat of bandits or wild animals. But the cowboy felt a strange sense of purpose, a pull that he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, he was responsible for someone other than himself, and that responsibility, heavy as it was, felt right. As they rode out of the trading post, the young woman finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere safe," he replied, keeping his eyes on the horizon. "Somewhere you can be free to make your own choices." Her eyes softened slightly, though she didn't fully trust him yet. She had been taken from her home, traded like an object, and the memory of that would not fade easily. But she sensed something different about this man, a quiet honesty, a willingness to protect rather than possess. It was a small spark, but in the vast, harsh landscape they were entering, even a small spark could mean the difference between hope and despair. The first miles of the journey were quiet, filled only with the soft sound of hooves against the dry earth and the wind rustling through the grass. The cowboy's mind wandered, thinking of the decisions that had led him here. He had always lived by his own rules, guided by survival and instinct. But now, with the young woman riding beside him, he felt a new kind of responsibility, one that weighed heavily on his conscience. Occasionally, she would glance at him, her expression unreadable. Sometimes it was suspicion, sometimes curiosity, sometimes a question she didn't yet know how to ask. He gave her space, understanding that trust could not be demanded, it had to be earned. And as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of crimson and violet, he realized that this journey was about more than just reaching a destination. It was about learning to understand someone else's world, about discovering what it meant to care for another human being when the world had taught him to care for no one. By the time night fell, they had made camp near a small stream. The cowboy gathered firewood and started a small fire, the flames dancing and casting shadows across their faces. The young woman sat a short distance away, watching him carefully. He offered her a small portion of food, and she accepted it without a word. The silence between them was comfortable in its own way, filled with unspoken understanding and mutual respect. As he lay under the stars that night, the cowboy thought about the day's events, the absurdity of the price paid, the smallness of 2 drinks and a sack of wheat compared to the value of a human life, and the unexpected responsibility now resting on his shoulders. He realized that the journey ahead would not be easy, that there would be moments of fear, anger, and doubt. But for the first time in a long while, he felt that he was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Somewhere in the darkness, the young woman finally spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you take me?" The cowboy looked up at the stars, thinking carefully before he answered. "Because no one should be treated like a thing to be traded," he said simply. "And because I knew you deserved better." Her eyes, reflecting the firelight, softened further. She didn't smile, but it was the closest thing to a truce he could hope for tonight. And in that small, fragile connection, the first steps of a shared journey had begun, one that would test both of them in ways they could not yet imagine, across the harsh, unforgiving frontier where danger and hope walked side by side. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and dry grass as the cowboy and the young Apache woman resumed their journey. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft, golden light across the plains. The cowboy adjusted his hat and checked his horse's saddlebags, making sure there was enough food and water for both of them. The young woman followed quietly, her eyes scanning the horizon as though she were counting every detail, every hill, every tree. There was a cautious energy about her, a sense of alertness that made the cowboy aware she was not someone to be underestimated. For miles, they rode in silence. The plains stretched endlessly, a vast expanse of browns and yellows, dotted with scrubby bushes and occasional patches of wildflowers. The cowboy kept one hand on the reins and the other resting near his rifle, alert to any sign of danger. The frontier was unpredictable. Bandits, wild animals, and even harsh weather could turn a simple journey into a fight for survival. But the cowboy noticed something else too, the young woman's quiet observation, the way she moved with care, the way she seemed to take in every detail around them. "Do you want to talk?" he asked gently after a while. She shook her head, her long dark hair catching the morning light. "Not yet," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the wind. He nodded, understanding that trust could not be forced. Instead, he focused on guiding the horse along the narrow trail, careful not to jostle her too much. Even though she had agreed to follow him, it was clear that every step of this journey was new and frightening for her. She had been taken from her home, thrust into a world she did not know, and now she had to rely on a man she barely knew. Hours passed, and the sun climbed higher, making the air warmer and the ride more exhausting. The cowboy noticed the young woman wincing as she adjusted her position on the horse. He reached over cautiously. "You're doing fine, we'll rest soon." She looked at him, eyes wary but grateful. "I've traveled far," she said finally. "I can manage." Her words impressed him. She had endured much, and yet she refused to show weakness. It made him feel both admiration and a weight of responsibility he hadn't anticipated. He knew that the journey ahead would test both of them, not just physically, but emotionally. By midday, they reached a small stream where the water ran clear and cool over smooth stones. The cowboy guided the horse down to the edge and let her drink, then offered water to the young woman. She knelt, cupped her hands, and drank carefully, her eyes never leaving him. There was a tension between them, a silent negotiation of trust, and the cowboy realized that small gestures, like offering water, keeping watch, or simply listening, were slowly building a fragile bond. They rested by the stream for nearly an hour. The cowboy started a small fire and roasted some strips of meat he had packed from the trading post. He handed her a piece, and she accepted it cautiously, biting into it slowly. "It's good," she said finally, giving him the smallest hint of a smile. "That's the idea," he replied, smiling slightly in return. The conversation, though limited, brought a strange sense of normalcy to the long ride. It was the first time she had spoken willingly, and he could tell she was beginning to see him not as a captor, but as someone who might actually care for her safety. And he, in turn, was learning more about her, not just the fear in her eyes, but the strength that had kept her alive. As they continued, the terrain began to change. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, and the path became rougher, strewn with rocks and small gullies. The horse stumbled occasionally, and the cowboy helped her regain balance each time. The young woman watched him carefully, noting how he moved, how he adjusted to the land, and how he never hesitated to help when needed. She began to understand that the man who had purchased her freedom with 2 drinks and a sack of wheat was not cruel or careless, but someone who lived by a strict code, someone who took responsibility seriously. Late in the afternoon, dark clouds started to gather on the horizon. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. The cowboy knew that storms could be dangerous on these open plains. Lightning could strike, rivers could swell, and paths could become nearly impassable. "We need to find shelter," he said, pointing to a small grove of trees not far off. The young woman nodded, trusting his judgment for the first time. As they approached the grove, a sudden crack of thunder made the horse startle. The cowboy held the reins tightly, steadying her, while the young woman leaned close, gripping the saddle for balance. It was a moment of fear, but also a moment of connection. They relied on each other, silently acknowledging that their survival depended on cooperation and trust. Once the horse was safely tied to a tree, they built a small shelter using branches and a tarp the cowboy had packed. The storm hit soon after and rain poured down, drenching the ground and soaking their clothes. But inside the makeshift shelter, they were dry enough, sitting close to the fire and watching the rain streak the landscape. The young woman finally spoke at length. "My family," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "They live far from here. I was taken while hunting. I didn't know who to trust. I never thought anyone would help me." The cowboy listened quietly, not interrupting. He understood that she needed to tell her story in her own time. "You're safe now," he said finally. "I won't let anyone hurt you." Her eyes met his, and for the first time he saw a glimmer of hope there. It was faint, but it was real. She had endured pain, fear, and uncertainty, yet she was still strong, still alive, still willing to move forward. And he felt a responsibility not just to protect her, but to honor her courage and resilience. The storm raged through the night, lightning flashing across the sky and thunder rolling like distant drums. Yet inside the small shelter there was a strange sense of peace. They had survived the first day together, navigated danger, and begun to understand each other. The young woman's trust was growing, and the cowboy's sense of purpose was deepening. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the plains refreshed and glistening. The cowboy and the young woman mounted the horse again and continued their journey. The land was more challenging now, with narrow paths and steep hills, but they moved carefully, watching each other's steps and keeping close. The young woman had begun to share small bits of her knowledge of the land, where water could be found, which plants were safe to eat, which areas to avoid. The cowboy listened, realizing that she was not just a passenger on this journey. She was a partner, teaching him things he had never noticed before. Along the way, they encountered other travelers. A small group of settlers moving with wagons, a family of shepherds guiding their flock, and once, a lone horseman who eyed them suspiciously before riding past. Each encounter was a reminder that the world they were traveling through was unpredictable, filled with both danger and kindness. The cowboy learned to be vigilant, but he also saw that human beings could be helpful, even in the harshest environments. By the end of the second day, they reached a ridge that overlooked a wide valley. From this height, the land stretched endlessly, dotted with streams, patches of trees, and distant mountains. The young woman sat on a rock, catching her breath, and gazed at the horizon. For the first time since being taken from her home, she allowed herself a small moment of wonder. The cowboy watched her quietly, realizing that this journey was about more than just travel. It was about reclaiming a sense of safety, trust, and freedom. That night, as they camped in a small hollow near the edge of the valley, the young woman finally spoke without hesitation. She told stories of her childhood, of her family, and of the land she had loved. Her voice was soft, yet filled with pride and strength. The cowboy listened, realizing that her past was not just a memory. It was a part of who she was, and it would shape the choices they made together. For the first time, they laughed together, small chuckles that felt out of place in the harsh wilderness, but were a welcome relief nonetheless. The cowboy realized that moments like these, moments of shared humanity, were rare, and they would become the foundation of the fragile bond forming between them. As they settled for the night, the cowboy reflected on the journey so far. The young woman had begun to trust him, and he had begun to understand her. They had survived storms, navigated difficult terrain, and faced the uncertainty of the frontier together. And yet, he knew the hardest challenges were still ahead. The world outside their small camp was unforgiving, and every step forward would require courage, patience, and resilience. But for now, under a sky full of stars and with the quiet sounds of the valley surrounding them, there was a sense of calm, a fragile peace. They had made it through 2 days of travel, and they had done so together. The cowboy knew that this was only the beginning, that the journey would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. But he also knew that they were no longer alone, that trust had begun to grow, and that hope, however small, was taking root. The next morning, the cowboy woke to the soft rustling of leaves and the faint chirping of birds. The valley below was bathed in a gentle golden light, and the air smelled fresh after the rainstorm from the previous day. He glanced over at the young Apache woman who was already awake, tending to their small fire. She moved with a quiet precision, arranging sticks and stones to keep the flame steady, and the cowboy couldn't help but notice how capable she had become in just a short time. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat slightly. She looked up and gave a small nod. "Morning," she replied, her voice calm but alert. There was still a wariness in her eyes, but it was softer than before, a sign that the bond between them was growing. They ate a simple breakfast of bread and dried meat, sharing the food without speaking much. The cowboy could feel the tension building in the air, not just from the unknown challenges ahead, but from the fact that their journey was no longer just a physical one. Each mile brought questions, disagreements, and glimpses of their very different worlds. He could sense her mistrust, her hesitation to accept his choices, even when he was only trying to protect her. By mid-morning, they were moving again. The trail became rougher, winding through rocky hills that jutted up like jagged teeth against the sky. The cowboy guided the horse carefully, but even he had to slow down at times, hopping off to inspect tricky sections where loose stones threatened to unbalance the animal. The young woman followed on foot at these points, her eyes scanning for safe paths. She had begun to adapt quickly to the land, noticing small details, the grip of the soil, the scent of water in the distance, the subtle tracks of animals that could warn them of danger. "You're very observant," the cowboy said as she pointed out a narrow path that would save them from a steep drop. She shrugged. "I've had to notice things to survive." Her voice carried the weight of experience, and the cowboy nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. Survival had been her teacher, and now he was learning from her as much as she was learning from him. As they climbed higher, the sky began to darken again, not with rain this time, but with the shadows of distant clouds. The wind picked up, tugging at their clothes and hair, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke. The cowboy's instincts tensed immediately. Smoke could mean travelers, fires, or worse, trouble. He signaled for her to stop, and they crouched behind a boulder, peering down at the valley below. A small group of men on horseback appeared, moving quickly through the terrain. They wore worn jackets and hats pulled low, and the cowboy could see the glint of rifles on their shoulders. Bandits, or possibly hunters who would question anyone traveling through the area. The cowboy's jaw tightened. He had faced threats before, but now he was responsible for someone else. The young woman noticed the tension in him, and for the first time she did not speak. She simply watched, waiting for his next move. "We'll have to wait them out," he whispered. "Stay low, keep quiet." They pressed themselves close to the rocks, hearts pounding as the riders passed by without noticing them. The young woman's hand gripped the edge of her shawl tightly, and the cowboy could see her muscles coiled, ready to move if necessary. When the danger had passed, he exhaled slowly and turned to her. "You did well," he said, giving her a reassuring nod. She gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was a silent acknowledgement of the danger they had just survived together, and also a sign that she was beginning to trust his guidance. By afternoon, they reached a narrow canyon where the trail became treacherous and the walls rose high on either side. The sun cast sharp shadows, making the rocks look jagged and threatening. The horse stumbled on loose stones, and the cowboy jumped down to steady her. "Careful now," he warned, scanning the path ahead. The young woman followed closely, moving with cautious grace. Her eyes were sharp, noting every step, every change in terrain. "We should go slower," she suggested. "The rocks are loose here." He nodded, silently impressed. Her instincts had saved them both from a dangerous fall. In that moment, he realized that this journey was no longer just about reaching a destination. It was about learning to rely on each other. Each decision, each step forward, required cooperation and trust. As the sun began to set, they found a small overhang in the canyon to rest. The cowboy made a fire, and the young woman gathered small branches and dry leaves to keep it going. The shadows of the canyon walls stretched long and dark, giving the place a quiet, isolated feeling. They ate a sparse dinner, the silence between them heavier than usual. The cowboy knew the tension was not just from the day's travel, it was from the unspoken fears they both carried. "I don't know if I can ever trust people fully again," the young woman admitted quietly, staring into the fire. "I've been betrayed too many times. Taken from my home, sold, I've learned to rely only on myself." The cowboy listened, understanding the depth of her words. "I don't expect you to trust me completely," he said. "But I can promise you this, I won't let anyone hurt you, not now, not ever." Her eyes met his for a moment, and he saw the flicker of hope, though it was buried beneath layers of fear and past pain. I'll try," she said finally. The night was long, filled with the sounds of the canyon, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, and the occasional crack of a falling rock. The cowboy kept watch, rifle close, while she slept. He realized that the responsibility he had taken on was heavier than he had imagined. Protecting someone was not just about survival. It was about understanding, patience, and courage in the face of constant uncertainty. The next morning, the trail became even more difficult. They had to cross a shallow but fast-moving river. The water was cold and strong, and the rocks beneath the surface were slippery. The cowboy went first, guiding the horse carefully. The young woman followed, stepping lightly and carefully, her eyes focused on each stone. She stumbled once, but the cowboy was there immediately, offering a steadying hand. "Thank you," she said, breathless but smiling faintly. "You're welcome," he replied. "We look out for each other." The small statement carried weight. Each obstacle, each challenge, was teaching them to rely on one another. It was no longer just a journey of physical distance. It was a journey of learning, understanding, and growing together. By midday, they encountered a small settlement, a cluster of wooden cabins and smoke rising from chimneys. The cowboy approached cautiously, aware that not everyone would welcome travelers, especially a man with an Apache woman. The townspeople eyed them warily, whispering among themselves. Some looked curious, some suspicious, but none approached. The cowboy led the horse through the settlement slowly, keeping the young woman close. "Stay calm," he whispered. "We're just passing through." They stopped at the edge of the town, and the cowboy bought some fresh bread and water from a small shop. The young woman watched, fascinated by the simple exchange, the way people interacted, and the subtle codes of behavior she had never learned. For her, every encounter was a lesson, and every lesson a small step toward understanding this strange, new world. That evening, as they camped on a hill overlooking the settlement, the young woman spoke at length about her life before she had been taken. She spoke of her family, her village, and the lessons her elders had taught her about survival and respect for the land. The cowboy listened intently, realizing that her strength came not just from endurance, but from knowledge, culture, and pride in who she was. "You have survived much," he said finally, "but you're not alone anymore. You don't have to carry it all by yourself." Her eyes softened, and for a brief moment, the fear and mistrust in her expression eased. She began to see that the cowboy was not there to control her, but to protect her, and that perhaps, in time, trust could grow between them. The night settled quietly, the stars bright above them. The cowboy reflected on the journey so far, the obstacles they had faced, the growing trust, and the fragile bond forming between them. He knew the challenges ahead would be even greater, but he also knew that they were stronger together than apart. By the time they fell asleep, both of them had changed. The young woman had begun to open her heart to the possibility of trust, and the cowboy had learned the weight and value of protecting someone not as property, but as a human being. The struggle had only just begun, but they were facing it side by side, ready for whatever the frontier had in store. The morning air was sharp and cool, and the cowboy could see the sun slowly climbing over the hills, casting long shadows across the land. The valley below was quiet, almost too quiet, and he sensed that the journey was about to become more dangerous. The young Apache woman stirred beside him, stretching and rubbing her arms against the morning chill. She had begun to trust him more now, but there was still a careful watchfulness in her eyes, a readiness for anything the land might throw at them. As they prepared to move on, the cowboy noticed signs of recent travel on the trail, broken branches, disturbed soil, and faint footprints. His instincts told him that other riders had passed through recently, and not all travelers in these parts were friendly. He signaled for the young woman to stay close, and they moved cautiously along the narrow trail that wound through the hills. The terrain was steep and rocky, each step a test of balance and care. "You've become strong," the cowboy said quietly, watching her navigate a tricky section of the trail. She glanced at him, a faint smile flickering across her face. "I had to be," she said simply. "The world doesn't wait for anyone." Her words lingered with him as they continued. He realized that her strength was not just physical but also mental, an unyielding determination to survive and adapt. And yet, he also understood that no one could face these dangers alone, no matter how strong they were. They needed each other, now more than ever. By mid-morning, the trail led them to a narrow pass between two rocky cliffs. The wind whistled through the gap, carrying dust and small pebbles. As they carefully navigated the path, the cowboy spotted movement ahead, a small group of men armed and riding fast coming straight toward them. He froze for a moment, assessing the situation. Bandits, perhaps, or rival hunters. Either way, they were dangerous, and the cowboy knew that any wrong move could cost them both their lives. "Get down," he whispered, crouching behind a large boulder. He gestured for the young woman to follow. They pressed themselves close to the rock as the riders drew near, their hooves clattering against the stone-strewn path. The bandits were looking for trouble, and they had clearly spotted something unusual, a man traveling with a native woman. The cowboy's mind raced. He could try to outrun them, but the path was narrow and the horse might stumble. He could fight, but they were outnumbered. He needed a plan, and fast. "Stay low," he said again, his voice steady despite the tension. "When I give the signal, we move." The riders passed close, their eyes scanning, their hands twitching near their weapons. The young woman's hand gripped the edge of her shawl tightly, but she didn't panic. The cowboy admired her calm, even in the face of immediate danger. When the bandits finally moved past without noticing them, he let out a slow breath, relief washing over him. "That was too close," he muttered. "We have to keep moving, faster this time." The young woman nodded, understanding the urgency. They pushed the horse forward, navigating the rocky terrain with renewed caution. The trail soon opened into a small canyon, and the cowboy hoped that its narrow walls would provide cover from any further threats. By late afternoon, they reached a shallow river that cut through the valley floor. The water moved swiftly, and the rocks were slippery, making the crossing risky. The cowboy dismounted and tested the footing carefully before leading the horse across. The young woman followed on foot, moving slowly but steadily. The current tugged at her boots, but she held her balance, guided by the cowboy's watchful eye. Once they reached the other side, they stopped to rest briefly. The young woman looked at the river, her expression thoughtful. "The land teaches you," she said quietly. "You have to watch, listen, and respect it, then it will let you survive." The cowboy nodded, impressed by her wisdom. "You've learned much," he said. "And I've learned from you." They traveled on, the sun dipping lower and casting long shadows across the plains. The cowboy noticed dark clouds gathering on the horizon, signaling another storm. But this time, it was not just the weather they had to worry about. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from the trees, a sign of people or perhaps trouble. His heart tightened. "Looks like we're not alone," he said, alerting the young woman. They approached cautiously, keeping low and moving slowly. As they drew closer, they could see a small group of men and women tending a campfire. The cowboy scanned the area, looking for signs of danger. The group seemed ordinary enough, but in this land, appearances could be deceiving. Suddenly, one of the men spotted them and shouted, pointing. "Hey, who are you? Stop there!" The cowboy raised his hand slightly, signaling that they meant no harm. "We're just passing through," he called out. The man's eyes narrowed. "Not many strangers pass this way." "Come closer." The cowboy exchanged a quick glance with the young woman. He could sense her fear, but also her trust. She would follow his lead, and he had to make the right decision. Slowly, they approached the camp, keeping their hands visible. The group studied them carefully. One of the women stepped forward. "You're traveling with her?" she asked, her tone cautious but curious. "Yes," the cowboy replied. "She's with me. I won't let anyone harm her." The woman looked at the young Apache woman, then back at the cowboy. "Then you're welcome to stay for the night," she said finally. "It's safer here than on the open trail." Relief washed over both of them. They joined the group around the fire, sharing what little food they had and exchanging stories of the land, the weather, and the dangers that roamed the plains. The cowboy could see that the young woman was slowly relaxing, her body less tense, her eyes more open. The camp offered safety, if only temporary, but it was enough for them to regain their strength and plan the next part of their journey. Night fell, and the fire crackled warmly. The cowboy sat close to the young woman, watching the shadows dance across her face. She had begun to trust him more now, sharing small details of her life and experiences. But he knew the path ahead would test that trust in ways neither of them could predict. The frontier was unforgiving, and every choice carried consequences. Suddenly, a distant shout broke the quiet of the night. The cowboy's instincts kicked in immediately. Someone was approaching, fast. He stood, signaling the young woman to stay calm. They moved to a position where they could see without being seen. Through the darkness, they spotted figures moving quickly toward the camp, bandits, no doubt, drawn by the fire and the presence of travelers. The cowboy's mind raced. He had to protect the young woman, and he had to protect the others in the camp. He whispered instructions, organizing the travelers to stay low and hidden. The bandits rode closer, shouting and waving their weapons, demanding food, supplies, or trouble. The cowboy stepped forward, his voice strong and commanding. "Leave them alone. This is their camp." One of the bandits laughed harshly. "And who's going to stop us? You." The cowboy's hand rested on his rifle, ready but calm. He knew that fighting might be necessary, but he also hoped for a solution without bloodshed. The young woman stayed close, her trust in him evident as she watched his every move. The standoff lasted tense moments that felt like hours. The cowboy's steady presence, the determination in his voice, and the readiness in his stance finally made the bandits reconsider. Slowly, they backed away, muttering threats but leaving the camp intact. The cowboy exhaled deeply, relief mingling with exhaustion. The young woman turned to him, her eyes wide. "You saved us," she said, voice trembling. "I promised I would protect you," he replied. "And I meant it." That night, as the camp settled back into quiet, the cowboy reflected on the events of the day. The young woman had begun to see him not just as a guide or protector, but as someone who could be trusted in a dangerous world. And he, in turn, had learned the depth of her resilience, courage, and wisdom. The journey ahead would be harder, filled with storms, threats, and tests of trust. But they had survived this challenge together, stronger than before. The bond between them had deepened, and they were ready for whatever the frontier would throw at them next. The next morning, the sun rose gently over the valley, casting warm light across the plains. After the chaos of the previous day, the cowboy and the young Apache woman felt a sense of quiet determination. The night had tested their courage and trust, and they had survived. Now it was time to continue the journey, moving closer to safety and freedom, but also facing the reality that life on the frontier was never easy. They packed their camp slowly, ensuring nothing was left behind. The young woman moved with purpose, gathering supplies and checking the horses' gear. There was a calm confidence in her movements now, born of experience and trust. The cowboy watched her, silently acknowledging how much she had grown since the day he had first freed her from the trading post. She had transformed from a wary, cautious traveler into a resilient and resourceful partner. As they rode along the trail, the cowboy reflected on their journey. Each day had brought danger, uncertainty, and challenge, yet also small victories, laughter, and lessons. The young woman had taught him patience, understanding, and the importance of trust. He had taught her in turn that not all people sought to harm, and that sometimes kindness could exist even in a harsh world. Their bond, fragile at first, had grown stronger with every step, every obstacle overcome together. By midday, they came across a small river, wider and calmer than the one they had crossed days earlier. The water sparkled in the sunlight, and the surrounding trees offered a sense of peace. The cowboy guided the horse carefully into the shallow water, the young woman following with confidence. As they reached the other side, she paused and looked back at the valley they were leaving behind. "I never thought I would see it again," she said softly, her voice tinged with both sorrow and gratitude. "The land, it was dangerous, but it was home." The cowboy nodded, understanding the mix of emotions she felt. "I know," he said. "And I hope you will find a place to belong again, one where you are safe and free." She gave a small smile, the first full smile he had seen from her since their journey began. "Maybe," she replied, "but for now I'm glad I have someone I can trust." As they continued, the trail led them to a small settlement, a cluster of wooden cabins with smoke rising from chimneys and children playing nearby. The cowboy knew they had reached a place where she could find safety and support. He guided the horse slowly through the settlement, careful to show that they meant no harm. The townspeople watched with curiosity and caution, but no one threatened them. They stopped near a well in the center of the village, and the cowboy helped the young woman down from the horse. She looked around, taking in the sights and sounds of the settlement, people talking, laughter of children, the smell of bread baking. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of hope, a small spark of possibility for a future she had not dared to imagine. A kind-looking woman approached them, her eyes warm and welcoming. "You've traveled far," she said. "Come rest and eat, you're safe here." The young woman nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. The cowboy stayed close, watching her interactions carefully. He knew that trust was a delicate thing, easily broken, and he wanted to ensure that she felt supported, not pressured. Over the next few days, they settled into the settlement, finding shelter and provisions. The young woman began to speak more freely, sharing stories of her past, her family, and her village. The townspeople listened with respect, impressed by her courage and resilience. The cowboy remained nearby, a steady presence, offering guidance when needed but allowing her to reclaim her independence. One afternoon, as they walked along the edge of the settlement, she turned to him. "I owe you my life," she said softly. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," he replied. "You survived because you are strong. I only helped guide you a little. You earned every step of this journey." Her eyes glistened with emotion. "I learned from you too," she said. "You showed me that not everyone is cruel. That even in a hard world, someone can care." The cowboy smiled, feeling a quiet satisfaction. The journey had been difficult, filled with danger, uncertainty, and hard choices, but it had also brought understanding, trust, and mutual respect. He realized that the greatest reward was not the end of the journey, but the connection they had forged, the bond of shared survival and understanding. In the evenings, they would sit by a small fire, talking quietly and reflecting on the days gone by. The young woman spoke of her family, of the land she missed, and of the lessons she had learned from the journey. The cowboy listened, offering advice and encouragement, and occasionally sharing stories from his own past, the hardships, mistakes, and small triumphs that had shaped him into the man he had become. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of red and orange, the young woman turned to the cowboy. "I think I'm ready to move forward now," she said. "I need to find a place where I can truly belong, where I can live freely and safely." The cowboy nodded, understanding the importance of her words. "I'll help you," he said. "I won't stop you from finding your path. You deserve to choose your own future." Tears filled her eyes, a mix of gratitude and relief. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." The next morning, they prepared to part ways. The young woman had arranged for a guide in the settlement who would help her travel to a safe place where she could start a new life. The cowboy packed his gear and mounted his horse, watching her as she prepared for the journey ahead. "Be safe," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You too," she replied, her eyes bright with determination. "And thank you for showing me that trust and kindness still exist in the world." They embraced briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they had formed, the struggles they had endured, and the lessons they had learned together. Then with a final wave, she mounted her horse and rode toward her new future, guided by the settlement's path and her own strength. The cowboy watched her go, feeling a mixture of pride and melancholy. The journey had changed both of them. She had grown stronger, more confident, and ready to face the world on her own terms. He had learned the weight and importance of protecting someone, of trust, patience, and the quiet power of kindness. As he turned his horse and began riding away, he looked back one last time at the settlement, at the young woman disappearing into the distance, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The frontier was harsh and unforgiving, but in its vastness, it had also allowed for courage, trust, and human connection to flourish. For the cowboy, life would continue as it always had: long trails, dusty plains, and the endless horizon. But now, he carried with him the memory of a journey that had changed him forever. He had learned that even in a world full of danger and hardship, acts of kindness, courage, and trust could create bonds that would last a lifetime. As the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky with colors of gold and purple, the cowboy rode on, his heart lighter and his spirit strengthened. The journey of two lives, once strangers, had ended not in loss, but in growth, understanding, and the promise of new beginnings. The frontier stretched endlessly before him, full of unknown challenges, but also full of possibility. And for the cowboy and the young Apache woman, the memories of their journey, of trust earned, courage shown, and friendship forged, would remain a guiding light for the rest of their lives. Though their paths were now separate, the bond they shared would endure. She would carry the lessons of courage and trust into her new life, and he would carry the knowledge that even the smallest acts of compassion could change lives forever. The cowboy rode on into the fading light, knowing that their story was not just about survival. It was about humanity, respect, and the strength found in connection. And in that quiet understanding, both of them had found something far more valuable than anything the frontier could ever take away: hope, freedom, and the power of trust.